Good morning all, and thank you for attending the DMA B2B Council Roundtable discussion, where today we're going to be talking about the principles of partnership, or POP, in B2B. The B2B POP is a non-for-profit industry collaboration with the aim of promoting best practice for agencies and brands to build long-term, highly productive and valuable relationships. The DMA B2B Council is proud to support this initiative. Today, probably more than ever, there's a need for greater communication and engagement between brands and their agency partners. But the landscape has changed. With the increased reliance on technology, the requirement to have skilled people to maximize the benefits of that technology, the fluctuation in the need and or ability to recruit and retain the right staff, never mind the current economic situation, is all leading us to having to examine who, where, when and how is it right to build the right partnerships between our brands and our agency partners. And with this, I'd like us to kind of kick off the discussion today around trying to understand what's the state of relationship between agencies and brands today, and what are the steps, what are the processes, what are the frameworks that we need to put in place to actually start to overcome some of these issues. So let me start by asking the panel, what are some of the common issues or challenges that you've experienced in your relationship between brands and agencies? So let's open up to the floor. Who would like to come back with some of those thoughts on that?
I can sort of kick this off, Richard. So I think one of the things that I've noticed, and it might be the reason why we're having this conversation, is the lack of balance or the lack of weighting between client and agency. I almost would say that we probably shouldn't call it client and agency, because it almost starts off the psychology that it's not an equal relationship, which I think in essence it probably needs to get back to. It needs to get back to more of a partnership rather than this client vendor or client agency relationship. So that's one thing I would say, and I've seen that when it gets into review processes. So the agency maybe, and this could also happen from the conditioning. So agencies sometimes condition clients into that by saying, review us. Here's our quarterly review. Can you fill out the review process? Where I actually think it should be bi-directional. I think there should be probably not only the agency being reviewed, but also the client. So my experience of that was also that without doing that, we realized that there were issues underneath that were impacting the ability for the agency to perform, which was reliant on the input or better input from the client. Again, I would probably call them a partner, or some sort of agency partner rather than just a client. So that's just a bit of my thinking, is that unevenness in and the psychology also within that relationship that's probably not been the best.
That's a really interesting point, and I'm not sure if you noticed in my introduction, I tend to use the word agency and brand rather than client and agency, because it really does, in my mind, need to be a partnership on that. Interesting. Donna, what are your thoughts on this?
Thanks, Richard. Yeah, I think it's a really mixed bag, actually. I think you've got some really strong kind of marketing leadership within the brands where they're really driving for long-term partners and see the agencies as a real extension to their teams. And I think also there's an increase, or I should say a decrease of kind of like formal marketing education as well. So I think people are doing what's been expected and what's been passed down to them. And I think kind of it's sort of like it's in both of our interest really to make sure that we're kind of forming new ways of working and going for the long term rather than yearly or kind of like every 3-year review processes to find new partners.
Okay, interesting. Helen, do you have some thoughts on this?
I was just going to say that I think the relationships aren't just one-on-one. So it's not just between a brand and the agency that you work with, because our agencies have to work together and multiple suppliers have to work together as well. So you might have your tech suppliers, your creative agencies, your media agency, and it really definitely takes a team to get things done. And that just makes the ways of working complex, the operating models complex, even remuneration. and they can all be barriers, and it takes quite a bit of work and information sharing to work through that. And even like within quite a large business like ourselves, you've got silos within the company that our different partners have to navigate. So yeah, there's quite a lot of teamwork and collaboration across inside and outside of brands, I think, to get marketing delivered these days.
Richard, could I add something onto that?
Of course, Andrew.
Yeah, so as a brand or a client side, typically, I think one of the things that we miss sometimes is that collaboration, as we've just been talking about, between the different groups. And in particular, the collaboration that leads to great ideas or innovation. There's lots of examples in industry and academia that getting people with different backgrounds together is how you find innovation, new ideas. And I think that having an arm's length supplier-buyer relationship makes it very difficult to have those collaborative aha moments where you get a lot of people in a room, even if it's on Zoom in current COVID world, but you get a lot of people together with very different backgrounds to debate what are the options and come up with a really creative idea. And so I think having that more balanced power relationship, I think, plays into that collaborative, getting these different thought worlds together.
Really interesting point there. Scott, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, so building on all of that, I'd add in what I'd call the lost in translation factor. So from a kind of an agency and a client side, it's making sure everyone kind of understands what the purpose of the campaign or the piece of creative work is, understand the factors that are going to kind of impact it. And building on Andrew's point about kind of the teams that are involved, quite often procurement sort of happens after the marketing agency meeting. And what their understanding is the purpose is often how much it's going to cost, which isn't necessarily what's the creative driver that you're trying to put together and the purpose of the campaign to begin with. So I think it's making sure the right people are involved in the conversation and everybody has a very clear understanding of what the outcome everyone is driving to is. And then you avoid that kind of lost in translation part.
Yeah, really interesting. And I'm actually quite fascinated by the multi-company nature of these partnerships that Helen raised there, which is it's not just a one-to-one, it's a 1, 2, 2 or 3 or 4, and particularly with technology vendors coming in. I've experienced in the past that there's the language in the market of the lead agency. And I'm just wondering what people's thoughts are on that. If you're an agency, you happy that somebody else is termed the lead agency, that have that closer relationship? How does that work? Donna, you've got some thoughts on this?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's it's quite complex, and I think it was Helen that was saying it's kind of many to many relationship really now, and because marketing is expected to do far more in terms of their remit, there's going to be many more players. So I think speaking from an agency side, it's not a case of kind of being the one-stop shop anymore. I think you have to play nicely, and I think it's really critical to kind of like establish those really clear ways of working, those clear boundaries, and just make sure that the whole team have that common purpose and that common goal that they're driving to, so it is working as one team, and just kind of like spending the energy on driving towards that purpose rather than conflict or kind of like misunderstanding really.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. Jason, what's it like in your world?
I think in our world, to bridge both of those questions and to sort of expand on, I think, points that Scott and Donna are making, is there are lots of things you can do, and there's the tactics and the strategy, but what we see is it still largely boils down to leadership and context and individuals taking responsibility. And I think on agency side, too often you've gone through a pitch process and you're so preoccupied with selling something and winning something that you forget to actually reset the relationship, recontextualize and understand your client's world and where you live within that. Instead, you sort of put yourself in this delivery mode and you go plowing through it rather than having this reset of actually This is a new relationship. It's a complex environment. Where do we live within that? What's our true value within that? Especially if you apply it to the question you're asking there, which is invariably a client bench, but also invariably a capability suite within the client-side environment, where often you're part of that overall team makeup rather than the full strategy execution unit. On the client side, what we see, what I see, is the same distinction, which is who in that team is taking the leadership and setting the tone of the relationship, and are they actively managing to set that standard across that team? Because these are learned behaviours, and all too often it's left alone, and it's just hoped that it'll happen organically. So I sort of come back to individuals and I come back to leadership because it requires consideration, it requires managing from our perspective.
That's fascinating that you're talking about that leadership and that taking responsibility. And that often, I've lived and experienced this, that often just kind of falls through the gaps. It is, as you say, let's win the business or let's buy the business. And then suddenly it's all about that process, not about actually once it's executed. Mario, this is your life, your being. You've researched this really extensively over the years. So what's your perspective on this?
Yeah, I didn't add this in my introduction, but I've worked both as a client and on the agency side, so I've got practical experience as well. I was thinking about this when I was invited, and one of the ways that I've found it helpful to approach this is to look at it from some alternative perspectives. Jason mentioned leadership, and I'll take that a step further. I wonder whether, so this is from sort of client perspective, first of all, I wonder whether clients should see themselves not so much as the client, but rather as a team leader. So consider the agency as part of your team. We often talk about agencies being an extension of the client's team. So actually treat them as part of your team rather than as a supplier. And secondly, remember that actually this is a co-creative process, and the agency can only deliver maximum value if the client is performing the role that's required of them. The other thing I just wanted to add from the client perspective is two ways I think of looking at it are for the client to remember what motivates the agency, because motivation is absolutely crucial here. Ultimately, we're talking often about creative people who, whose achievement is often linked to their emotions. And I would suggest that clients need to think about two things. One is control and the other is value, making sure that the agency feels they have control over the activities they're performing and the outcomes that are expected of them. And secondly, that they can perceive value in what they're doing and value in the outcomes. So I think control and value are really important. Final thing, and then I'll hand over. From an agency perspective, one of the things I think is quite important is for agencies to understand the tensions that clients feel. So for example, if I just give you a couple of examples, most clients understand, for example, the value of a really good brief. However, they're torn. They're multitasking. They'd like to sit down and spend a day writing a really good brief, but they're being pulled in other directions. So there's that tension. There's a tension, for example, around, the agency wants access to the decision maker, to the expert, but the client knows that they have to delegate and let the junior person have some responsibility. So there's a tension there. The agency wants autonomy, freedom, but yet the client wants the right result first time. So there's a tension there. So I think it's also about understanding that those tensions exist and working out how to manage them in a clever way. Fantastic.
Really interesting insight there. Claire, can I come to you? I mean, talk to me about the tensions that exist and the control and the value. What are your perspectives from being a brand marketer?
So I actually agree with a lot of what Mario's just said. I think for me, there's a in the kind of nature of a partnership, and I think it's right, it should be a a partnership arrangement. There's a kind of contracting piece up front, isn't there? And that's where you understand exactly who has responsibility for what, by, when. And so everybody's very clear on who's doing what, whether that's on the client brand side or whether that's on the agency side. Because if you don't get that right up front, then you're just going to falter the whole way through. I think the other thing for me is I have historically found it difficult to get agencies to understand the kind of the practical reality moment idea, and then there's the okay, how do we actually do this in practice? Because we've already got a website, we've already got branding, we've already got whatever it might be. And I feel sometimes that is quite a difficult balance to find in taking the original kind of creative brilliance and translating it into something that's pragmatic and deliverable. And I think sometimes that causes a bit of tension, Richard.
There we go. I knew we'd get to the tension at some point. Simon, you've kind of worn both hats on both sides. How do you feel about that? Once you've kind of moved from client side to agency side, do you start to see it from the other side at all?
Yeah, I think so. I think it's. I mean, I was going to mention a different point. I was going to build on sort of Andrew's points, and I think it was Mario mentioned the thing about this idea of at the client side or brand side, this team leader, and one of the things that I kind of faced personally, but also in looking at both sides, is this thing of you need somebody who can actually do this thing called boundary spanning, so they can go beyond the boundaries of the role, they can go beyond the boundaries of even functionality. I've seen this particularly when we try to get to something that matches customer expectations and is speaking the prospect's language. You need to be able to integrate more people, but whether it's sales enablement, whether it's a type of customer-facing material that is going to really speak to the customer better across a complex solution. One of the things that you almost need to have at both the agents and the client side, but the client side need to kind of drive it a bit better, is being able to integrate, non-marketeers, salespeople, sometimes even other functions, and that requires these boundary spanning skills, but also requires the ability to be able to understand how do we get to a talking the customer language. I mean, even if you just look at product-based stuff, so we all need to look at products, and I'm sure Scott will have this in IBM. Sometimes you need to integrate multiple different product pieces to actually talk something that really speaks solution. And that is challenging itself, because you need to be the facilitator. And it's almost like there's a confusion these days with, I need to know all the technology, I need to know all the stuff and all the bits and all the cogs to bring it together. Well, actually you don't. You just need to know enough to be able to bring those together and facilitate, almost facilitate the agency doing their job of obviously, creating that creative, creating that piece of work.
Thank you. Interesting perspective on that. Scott, you've been called out. Would you like to respond to that challenge from?
Yeah, sure. So sure thing. So totally agree with what Simon's mentioned, and it also picks up on something that Claire mentioned around the constraints. Kind of being really clear what you're working with. I just doodled down the one word honesty, because from personal experience, what tends to happen is it takes a while for the relationship to build, for the creative to be developed. And over that time, stakeholders tend to seep in, requirements tend to change, creativity tends to get diluted. And you sort of sometimes get to a point where you are missing the purpose of why you came together in the first place. So I think both parties kind of being really honest about what's the intent, and from the agency side, what are you capable of? What is it you are going to do? Because sometimes there is a little bit of a, we'll promise you the moon, and sometimes there is a, we want the moon, but actually we don't. So it's just keeping that conversation going, being honest. I think there's two things that help. Number one is having a really strong brief for the piece of work that you're creating and constantly going back to it. So, a solid brief that everybody involved in agrees to. and having a North Star, you know, really going back to that each time, checking as we move forward together, it's a partnership, are we still moving towards that North Star? And be honest, you know, if you're off track, why? Is it something you can resolve? Because quite often there's a push to the end, even if one or either side doesn't actually feel it's going to end up with what they really want to get to.
Interesting. Suddenly you've taken me from the agency brand relationship almost into openness, honesty, transparency, marriage guidance type relationship, which is kind of interesting.
Well, it is a partnership. There you go. Those are all good things.
Absolutely.
Richard, could I chip in on that one, actually?
Of course.
Yeah, so I think the honesty bit is actually really, really interesting one. It's sort of got loads of facets to it. I think something that Scott alluded to there is that every agency has different skills and center of gravity. And actually one of the hardest things, unfortunately, is agencies have had a bit of a poor history and form in kind of saying they can do everything. And I think one of the things is just from the agency side to be ridiculously honest, not just about what you can do, but what's at the absolute heart of what you do, and you know, your center of gravity and the value you provide. To Helen's point, you're going to be in an ecosystem, so really play in your strong area where you add something. I think that's an honesty bit. I think the practical and logistics bit has got an honesty side to it. Most agency people have not been client side, so they don't know some of that practical, logistical, stakeholder management, QBR stuff that goes on behind the scenes. And so that having that really transparent for everyone, I think really, really helps as well. I just think that's a sort of level of honesty that really, really helps things, because it's, you know, stuff changes, stuff goes wrong, objectives could change, you know, stakeholders can change. I just think maximum transparency on that really, really helps everyone. I also think one of the hardest bit as well is that, back to the center of gravity, that also throws huge disparities in time and cost in terms of different agencies. You could put a spec of the same job out to 10 agencies and you'll get really different time and cost responses, and that's down to the skills and center of gravity piece. So again, I think that's just a really honest conversation of where each agency provides value and where it doesn't, and where it plays.
I like the point there that you mentioned, that, you know, most agency people haven't worked brand side, but actually most brand side haven't worked agency either. And so we're looking at the same thing through very different lenses, and that is definitely a challenge, and that's overcome by communication. Alex, may I come to you and get your perspective on this, not necessarily about the honesty side, but I think you'll probably have an interesting view.
Yes, I'd like to draw back to the points made around partnership, and also pick up on Claire's points. From a commercial perspective, the word partnership means something completely different, and I wonder if the adjustment needs to be made contractually as well, in terms of the way things are measured, monitored, what deliverables are put in place. And, you know, ultimately, are we talking about partnership just because of a relationship? We're talking about partnership using it in the commercial structure, because there are downsides to applying the word partnership in a commercial way. For example, you know, the longer term and more if you apply longer term measurables to restricted briefs, then you probably will restrict access to innovation, to more to broader thinking. And so I think this is probably a challenge for both sides. You know, do you really want a partnership, or do you want to have an easy way out? You know, do you want to have shorter term contracts? And of course, you know, from a supplier, you know, agency perspective, we're all after longer term relationships, right? So the question is that represented in the pitch and the commercial approach? You're on mute.
It's all right. I haven't been doing this for 18 months or anything. What I take from that is, again, it comes down a little bit to language, and the language that we're using, whether that be, you know, client, agency, partnership, relationship, long-term, short-term, which is fascinating. Shane, what are your perspectives on this? I mean, you've kind of lived in both worlds, in all worlds, huge amounts of experience. So I'd really welcome any take that you've got.
Yes, I think that's really interesting, sort of working in both worlds. You do see that the both sides, and I do really agree with this description of it being as partnership or relationship. And certainly it's not just about, as Chris said, the agency being honest as to its capabilities, what it can do and what it can't do. And there are some that you see pushing the envelope for, obviously, for revenue reasons, that they can stretch a little bit more beyond their core capabilities. But I have to say, I've also seen that from clients, and that actually, and I don't know, and it'd be interesting to hear from some of the clients on this, but being open with your agency takes quite a brave marketer, because actually you work for a brand that you're probably very proud of, but you do know it warts and all. And just how sure, confident are you to share that? And it's not the sort of thing you do say on a first date. You need to get to know somebody to the point that's been made brilliantly about trust before you do sort of go, actually, it's not all quite so great. And if we lift this bonnet up over here, it's really, really broken, but you can help us. And I think that's where I see amazing relationships develop with agencies that work with clients, because there's this trust on both sides and they get the best out of it. The other thing, coming back to the point about this huge ecosystem that we work in now, suppliers, agencies, clients, it's so big, keeps me busy. It's great because I act as a bit of a translator between all these bodies. But you also see fantastic creative sparks when you get this trust in the room that one agency will say, we can't do that, but we know that's your specialty, or a client hearing from other teams and getting ideas from each other. So working well together can be very exciting. The opposite can be dire.
It's funny, a couple of you have mentioned kind of you get sparks when you're in the room together and when you're getting people together. Just wondering if there's something around the lack of physical contact that we've had recently that has made that more challenging. I know that I've missed the whiteboard, I'll be honest with you. I'm probably oversharing there, but that's one of those things that, kind of just being there and actually, as you say, just throwing ideas around and coming up with new solutions with I made a note here of with a wider gene pool. And by that, I mean, it's not just people from one company or another. It's kind of 2 or 3 companies with different worldviews. I think it's really important. Donna, what are your perspectives on this? I'm sure that you've come across many organizations. Have many of them been brave and been open and trustworthy with you and the information that they provide?
Yeah, and actually I've also worked client side for kind of half of my career as well, and I do actually wish that I'd had more access to the agency side when I was younger. It would have made me a much better kind of like partner to an agency as well. So I think coming back to that point, it's really, I guess, what you say about trust, or what Shane was just talking about, trust. I think that's probably fundamental to that kind of better longer term relationship, and it's certainly where we see the kind of the most creative work and the better relationships coming from. And I think, although lockdown has had its challenges, I think, like you say, the lack of the whiteboard or getting together, actually it's been a great leveler as well. It's meant that, we've got to speak to marketing directors while they're sat in their spare room, or while they're in the kitchen while their kids are learning next to them. And I think it sort of takes me on to, it's really important to get to know the people that you're working with, rather than just kind of the brands and the organizations. So at Omobono, we've done a huge amount of work and gone through our own transformation to kind of become, I guess, like a sort of a partner of the future. And one of the things that we do is kind of spend time with our clients, getting to know them, getting to know kind of, what they're aiming to get to as an individual, what they're targeted on, and also on the flip side of that, retroing. So kind of retroing monthly, what's and all, what have we loved about what we've done, kind of what's not gone so well, what learnings do we take forward. So I think kind of trust also comes from just knowing each other better as well.
Really interesting. There's some common language starting to come out about this, around that honesty, openness, and trust. Helen, from your side, what's your perspective on this conversation?
Yeah, I think it kind of really chimed with all of us in this glass-walled room, didn't it? When Scott said honesty was the word he wrote down. And it's fundamental in like personal relationships and working relationships. And having that sort of clarity of thought and being brave enough to be honest about the warts and all side of a brand, that's definitely true. And I was also going to say that the other benefit I see on the back of honesty is how when you work with your agencies, they can help keep you accountable. Because you can be a very busy fool sometimes in marketing. So you're producing stuff all the time, you're building stuff, you're involved in MarTech, but are you actually delivering the outcomes? You can lose sight of that. And that's something I really value from the agencies that I work with, is they have that very strong focus and they keep you accountable. Just remind you to loop back, because initiatives also evolve and they take different paths. It can get quite complicated. So it's that accountability, I think, is really useful in how the relationships come together.
Again, that kind of touches a little bit on the leadership point that was raised earlier, and taking responsibility and making sure that there are people that do take responsibility to drive a relationship forward. Mario, again, let's come back to you. You've been looking at this quite a lot. So what's your perspective?
I just wanted to pick up on a couple of great points that I think have been raised. On the honesty issue, I think you mentioned that clients should be honest about the deficiencies of the brand, but I also think sometimes there's a lack of honesty around the client's own lack of self-confidence, and sometimes that translates into excessive control, telling the agency what to do almost to cover up their lack of confidence. And I think that's a shame in a way, because I think maybe it's when I've talked to people about this, they tend to say, well, it's only the junior marketers, the junior clients that do that, and I don't know to what extent that's true, but I think we shouldn't be afraid to say, actually, I don't know. Because if you think about it, how many clients have actually been through a process of learning how to evaluate, for example, creative work? It's a very subjective thing. And of course, we try and make it very, very rational and objective. But I do think I've spoken to marketing directors who've been in the job for 20 years who say, actually, when the agency comes and presents their concepts to me, I'm quite scared. And I don't always know what the best route response is. And I think sometimes, admitting that you don't know is not such a bad thing. And I think that comes down to that honesty thing. I'll mention one other thing, which fits in with this honesty and communication issue. I think sometimes because of a lack of communication, both partners aren't aware of what's going on. I'll give you an example. Sometimes clients can perceive that agencies are sort of stuck in a rut, that they've been delivering the same thing over and over again. And it looks like sort of inertia from the client perspective, whereas actually what could be happening and is happening on occasion is the agency is simply just delivering what it thinks the client wants and what the client has expressed happiness with in the past. So there can be a misinterpretation of what's going on, and that sometimes can be down to this whole lack of communication.
Yeah, that's it's really interesting. Again, it's that almost being worried about what you don't know and being seen to actually not know anything. When again, it comes back to that phrase that we've talked about just earlier, which is about being brave. And being brave is, yes, warts and all about this actually doesn't work very well in my company, but also exposing yourself to actually say, I don't know. The challenge with that is that when you're in the classic pitch situation, I often go towards the shiny thing, and I actually don't know whether that works or not. So yeah, some really interesting points on that. So maybe just the last couple of minutes, perhaps we could just talk through some examples or some key takeouts around what we need to have in place to within that framework to actually make sure that this works better. We've talked about a few of them. We talked about the open honesty, transparency, trust, those sorts of things. But at a practical level, what do we need to do? What are some of the key takeouts that we should be looking to recommend to others that are sitting in our shoes elsewhere? Perhaps, Donna, I could come to you to see if there's anything that kind of sticks out in your mind, in your role, that you see as best practice.
Yeah, sure. I think Claire mentioned it earlier, just kind of like not skipping over those very early conversations about ways of working, preferences, kind of understanding from both ends how the engines turn in the brand side and how the engines turn in the agency side. And kind of, you know, I would also say setting up that cadence of what those touch points are, because it's not going to be the same for any relationships. There's lots of different parts moving together, and kind of, you know, how often do you need to speak? What does that look like? How are you going to kind of like evaluate current performance, and you know, what's the kind of the learning methodology that you're going to employ? I think it's just sometimes in that setup, but also, you know, that can be done at any point. It can also be, you know, something to sort of take an existing relationship and turbocharge that into the future as well. Is just sort of, you know, looking at those ways of working and getting to know each other better.
Fantastic. Scott, from your perspective, what would be kind of the key one or two things on a practical level that you think that either the brand side or the agency side should really kind of go into this conversation with?
Yeah, sure. So all of the above. You know, clear. You know, I wouldn't necessarily go as far as a racy chart, but something that makes it clear, you know, who's involved, who's making which decisions, clear purpose and outcome. You know, what is everybody driving towards? That's reviewed frequently. As those of you that know me know, I'm a big fan of agile marketing. And one of the things that we don't do a lot in these sorts of pieces of work is the sort of retrospective side of things. We talk a lot about what work was done, but we don't talk very much about how the work was done and how we both feel about the relationship. And I think the best quality outcomes come from those sorts of conversations. It is born really of relationships built over time. So there are some things where you have a quick need, which is very much very clear. This is the need. This is the time frame. Very quick. There are some relationships which build over time. So you will use an agency for a longer period of time, and therefore the ability for that to kind of grow and mature and really understand each other changes. So lots of different factors to kind of consider. One thing I would throw into the mix, which we haven't talked about and is possibly another topic, is the in-house agency. So we're talking a lot about, you know, big agencies and, you know, big brands, but the way that work is done, and then you bring in sort of the freelancer world and how we're all working very kind of remotely at the moment. I think there's a lot of change on the horizon here, but the fundamentals of shared purpose and outcome, honesty, build relationships, I think are key no matter what you're doing.
Fantastic, thank you for that. And let's save the whole in-house agency for our next discussion, perhaps. Jason, what are your perspectives on these kind of final thoughts?
I think the in-housing and the agency bench reality is something you can't gloss over. And I think if you accept the reality in the way that we all work now and how organizations and agencies are set up, I think psychologically, my sort of dumb shorthand of everything that we've spoken to is park the procurement word, just shift it to recruitment. The moment you shift it into a recruitment mindset, then you understand that you have to bring people in, you have to nurture a relationship, and you have to understand the role that those individuals that you're bringing in have with your blended teams. And I think psychologically, if you just make a really simple adjustment, it can change. It can change a lot. It will change behaviorally. I think it has a large impact.
Very interesting, that whole kind of mindset approach. I think that's really valuable. Claire, final thoughts from you?
Thanks, Richard. So I think a couple of things, building on a point that Donna made about making sure you've got all the kind of regular cadence of meetings and everything in place. Thinking currently in this world, I would add to that, make sure you've got regular touch points which are more social and get to know you rather than just work. And I think allied to that, there's a piece here around ways of working and putting some kind of you know, charter or principles or whatever it might be down that says, you know what, it's okay that you've got to pick your kids up from school at 3 o'clock, or it's okay that, you know, Wednesday nights you're squashing out, or whatever it might be. So something for both parties, for both sides, that kind of just sets out actually what these expectations are, and what the kind of the red lines might be, the things that you don't cross, that you never push, you know, the boundary on. And I think that's particularly important in the current climate.
Yeah, very, very important point. I know lots of friends and peers working in agencies, particularly earlier in their career, where they've been expected to jump through hoops which are just completely unacceptable. Absolutely. Simon, some final thoughts from you?
Yeah, just quickly, I thought it was interesting the point that Mario made about sort of change and how we need to change. And I think there's an interesting thing going on. And well, obviously we all know this the last year, but the more companies, whether they're brand or agency side, are kind of saying that they've had more new remits or new demands set on marketing and for the agency, whether it's, you know, massive budget cuts, whether it's a change in what marketing needs to deliver and how they deliver. And I think kind of the follow on from what Scott said in terms of review and discussing and reviewing each other and having that more trust-based discussion of where and what we need to look at. I think there also needs to be a discussion of how we need to change. And that change almost needs to be accompanied with a bit of a roadmap, if it's possible, to give the agency time to change according to that, whether it's skills, capabilities, direction, whatever it is. And the same for the client. Obviously, if that's not the case, then it comes down to that honesty again in terms of, can the agency deliver and make those changes in the near or midterm. So that's the only thing I would say. I think the last thing is how do we work together to deal with change, because I think it's such a big topic at the moment.
Fantastic. And Mario, maybe a point from you, and then we'll come to one other person, I think.
Yeah, sure. No, it's just a quick one because it's sort of been touched on just in the last couple of minutes. But I would say, you know, don't think that every relationship is necessarily going to be the same. Of course, there will be different types of relationship. And I think if a relationship isn't working, if there isn't a good fit, then don't force it. I mean, brand managers are very good at, you know, they understand this process of when they're looking for customers of segmentation and targeting. And I think agencies need to practice the same thing. It's about, you know, segmenting the market, targeting the client firms, the brands that are right for you, and be honest. And it's a hard thing to do. You know, it's because what you're saying there is, I'm actually going to potentially reject work. But when you can be brave enough to do that, you're more likely to have good relationships rather than conflict.
Absolutely. That's something I personally feel very passionate about, is again, knowing if somebody's a good fit or not. And we talk about in our organization, absolutely that fit for process. Are we the right fit for you, and are you the right fit for us? So I think that's very very important. Katha, did you have something you wanted to just say as a final point?
Yes, thank you very much for this fascinating discussion. It's very enriching for me, especially that I've been teaching marketing communication and brand management for a few years now at Bournemouth University. Yeah, so I think this is a very important topic, and I think that client-agency relationship also depends on their understanding of the brand, because the brand is a living entity that goes through a life cycle. So it's very important that both understand where the brand is in this life cycle, and they agree on the stage of the life cycle. Otherwise, yeah, I think this session is extremely useful for myself as an academic, because I know what I'm adding in my student program, and definitely it will help me to form better future employees that will contribute to marketing agencies. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for your final comments there. So thank you all for your time and your contribution in the discussion today. Key takeouts for me include We need to change the psychology and the language. We need to make sure that there's a shared vision and shared expectations. Honesty, trust, openness, transparency are absolutely key. As a brand, you need to be brave and open. It's really important to make sure that that there's retrospectives throughout the course of that relationship. The relationships are becoming ever more complex with ever more organizations being involved in that. But I think the final point that kind of really stood out to me was that we should be thinking about this and the relationship as recruitment, not as procurement, which I think is a fascinating approach. If you'd like to find out any more information about the DMA or the DMA B2B Council, you can get in touch via the website, which is dma.org.uk. Also, to find out more about the B2B Principles of Partnership, feel free to check out the website, b2bpop.org. Thank you all very much indeed for your time today. It's been an absolute pleasure, and speak soon. Thank you.